The sun was shining, birds were singing. Mrs. Periwinkle adjusted her hat. It was a beautiful day for shopping. Mrs. Grubb, 2 feet away, scoffed. She clutched her handbag tighter. It was the same handbag Mrs. Periwinkle always admired. "Nice hat," Mrs. Grubb mumbled, her voice dripping with something sour. Mrs. Periwinkle beamed. Before she could reply, Mrs. Grubb continued. "It's a shame about your shoes." Mrs. Periwinkle glanced down at her sensible shoes. Confusion clouded her face. Then it happened. Mrs. Grubb, with surprising agility, snatched Mrs. Periwinkle's hat. Feathers flew as she flung it into the street. A gasp escaped Mrs. Periwinkle's lips. This was war. Mrs. Periwinkle, fueled by fury, lunged. She grabbed Mrs. Grubb's prized handbag. The handbag flew open, spilling its contents everywhere. Lipsticks, tissues, and a half-eaten pack of biscuits tumbled onto the pavement. The fight escalated quickly. Hair was pulled. Glasses went flying. The 2 elderly women grappled with a ferocity that belied their age. People stopped to stare. What had started as a petty argument had become a spectacle. A crowd gathered. They watched, eyes wide with a mixture of amusement and horror. Nobody dared to intervene. The air crackled with tension. Someone giggled nervously. Another person gasped. Mrs. Grubb, despite her smaller stature, was surprisingly strong. She managed to pin Mrs. Periwinkle against a shop window. The crowd watched, captivated, as the fight reached its climax. Suddenly, a siren wailed in the distance. The sound grew louder. A police car, lights flashing, pulled up beside the melee. 2 police officers jumped out. They swiftly separated the 2 brawling grandmothers. Mrs. Periwinkle and Mrs. Grubb, both disheveled and out of breath, were quickly apprehended. The crowd, their moment of bizarre entertainment over, began to disperse. One by one, they melted away, leaving the police officers and the 2 arrested women alone on the now quiet street.